Imagine you're a 10-year-old boy from the Balkans, torn from your family by raiders who promise your parents you'll receive an education in the great cities of the East. As the caravan disappears over the horizon, you have no idea that your childhood has just ended forever. Within weeks, you'll be subjected to a surgical procedure so brutal that half the boys who undergo it will die screaming. Those who survive will spend their lives as living tools, castrated, isolated, and psychologically broken to serve masters who view them as valuable property rather than human beings. This wasn't some rare medieval cruelty. This was systematic policy across the Caliphate territories that enslaved millions over 1,000 years. You think you understand historical slavery through American plantations? What you're about to discover about slave systems developed in early Islamic courts will reveal practices so methodical, so psychologically devastating, that they created entire classes of human beings designed to have no future, no families, and no hope of escape. Because slavery under the Caliphates didn't just exploit human labor, it became systematized with chilling precision. Between the 7th and 19th centuries, the expanding Islamic empires from Spain to Central Asia built their wealth and power on the systematic enslavement of millions of people captured through raids, conquest, and purchase. This wasn't the plantation-based agricultural slavery familiar from American history. The scale was staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that over 14 million Africans were enslaved by traders operating in these territories, more than the entire Atlantic slave trade. But slavery under the Caliphates extended far beyond Africa, encompassing Europeans from the Balkans and Caucasus, Central Asians, and even other Muslims who fell into debt or were captured during conflicts between rival powers. What made these slave systems particularly horrific wasn't just their scale, but their systematic approach to human modification. Unlike other slave systems that primarily sought labor, the imperial courts of the Abbasid and Umayyad dynasties developed specialized categories of slaves whose bodies were surgically altered to serve specific functions. Young boys were castrated to create eunuchs for harem service. Girls were trained from childhood as sexual servants. Boys were kidnapped and psychologically conditioned to become fanatically loyal soldiers who would fight against their own people. While religious texts provided regulations for slave treatment that superficially appeared humane, political systems often exploited those rules to horrifying extremes. The legal framework created an illusion of moral legitimacy that masked systematic human rights violations on an unprecedented scale. The horror began with what court sources euphemistically called the purification process, the mass castration of young male slaves destined for service in palaces and harems. This wasn't a rare procedure, but an industrial operation that processed thousands of boys annually, transforming children into eunuchs who could be trusted around women while being psychologically and physically incapable of rebellion. The procedure typically occurred at specialized centers in cities like Cairo, Baghdad, and Cordoba, where skilled practitioners had perfected techniques for maximizing survival rates while ensuring complete castration. Boys between 8 and 12 years old were considered optimal candidates, young enough for their bodies to adapt, but old enough to survive the trauma if they were strong enough. The operation was conducted without anesthesia, using crude bronze instruments that were heated to prevent infection. Contemporary medical texts describe the procedure in clinical detail that reveals its systematic nature. The boy would be restrained on a wooden table while practitioners removed all external genitalia, then inserted a metal tube to prevent the urethra from sealing shut during healing. Survival rates varied depending on the skill of the practitioner and the strength of the child, but historical sources suggest that between 30 and 60% of boys died from the procedure itself or from infections that developed afterward. Those who survived faced weeks of agony as their bodies healed, often developing complications that would affect them for life. But death wasn't the worst outcome. The boys who survived found themselves permanently altered in ways that went far beyond physical modification. The psychological impact of castration, combined with their separation from family and culture, created a class of human beings who were simultaneously valuable and utterly powerless, trusted servants who could never threaten their master's authority through family connections or sexual rivalry. The eunuch system had created the perfect slaves, intelligent, capable, but genetically dead, ended. The castration process was just the beginning of a systematic program designed to create psychological dependence that would last a lifetime. Surviving boys were immediately separated from other slaves and placed in specialized training programs that would reshape their identities, loyalties, and understanding of their place in the world. The conditioning began with religious conversion, often accompanied by the assignment of new names that severed connections to their original identities. A Christian boy from Serbia might become Abdul Rahman, while maintaining no memory or connection to his birth name. This wasn't simply religious education, but systematic identity erasure designed to create new personalities built around service and submission. Training programs lasted for years and were designed to create eunuchs who were both highly skilled and emotionally dependent on their masters. Boys learned languages, mathematics, music, and administrative skills that made them valuable, while also undergoing psychological conditioning that made independent thought dangerous and service natural. They were taught that their castration was a blessing that freed them from base desires and allowed them to focus on higher purposes. The most insidious aspect of eunuch training was how it convinced victims that their situation was preferable to normal life. Trainers would describe the responsibilities and suffering of normal men, supporting families, dealing with sexual desires, facing military conscription, while presenting eunuch life as peaceful and secure. Boys learned to feel grateful for their castration rather than resentful. Physical modifications often continued beyond initial castration. Some eunuchs underwent additional procedures to modify their voices, posture, or facial features, according to their intended roles. Palace eunuchs might receive treatments to maintain youthful appearances, while administrative eunuchs were trained in specific skills that made them indispensable to government operations. The psychological impact was devastating and permanent. Eunuchs developed what modern psychology would recognize as complex trauma responses, intense loyalty to authority figures, fear of independence, and inability to form normal relationships with other people. They became expert at reading the moods and desires of their masters while losing touch with their own needs and feelings. But the eunuch system was only one component of the Caliphate's systematic approach to human ownership. The treatment of female slaves revealed even more calculated cruelty designed to exploit the most intimate aspects of human nature. But the castration of boys was just the foundation of a slave system that would shock you with its systematic approach to sexual exploitation. What I'm about to describe reveals how the Caliphate's elite transformed the destruction of human dignity into an institution designed for total control. Before we dive into the most disturbing part, subscribe and hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next. And definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same curiosity about the darkest parts of human history. The next level involved the complete sexual subjugation of an entire gender. The concubine system represented slavery's most psychologically devastating innovation within many caliphate courts. The transformation of captured women and girls into sexual property whose entire existence revolved around satisfying their owner's desires. This wasn't prostitution, which implies some form of economic exchange, but absolute sexual ownership that reduced human beings to the status of living possessions. The procurement process was systematic and brutal. Slave traders specifically targeted young women and girls during raids on Christian and pagan territories, evaluating them like livestock based on physical attributes, age, and perceived fertility. The most attractive were reserved for wealthy buyers, while others were distributed according to a hierarchy that reflected their assessed value. Training began immediately upon capture and continued for months or years depending on the girl's intended role. Concubine schools operated throughout the empire's territories, where women were taught to suppress their own desires, personalities, and cultural identities while developing skills designed to please male owners. They learned dance, music, conversation, and sexual techniques, while being systematically broken psychologically. The conditioning process was designed to create women who appeared willing and enthusiastic while being completely powerless. Trainers used a combination of rewards and punishments to shape behavior, creating psychological responses that made resistance feel impossible even when physical restraints were removed. Women learned to anticipate their master's desires and fulfill them without being asked, creating an illusion of consent that masked systematic abuse. The scale of sexual slavery was staggering. In practice, within the imperial courts of the Abbasid dynasty, wealthy rulers maintained harems containing hundreds of concubines, while even middle-class men typically owned several sexual slaves. The Abbasid Caliph al-Muqtadir reportedly owned 11 concubines, requiring an elaborate administrative system just to manage his human sexual property. But the true horror lay in the psychological destruction of the women involved. Concubines were deliberately isolated from other women to prevent solidarity and rebellion. They competed against each other for their master's favor, creating relationships based on jealousy and manipulation rather than mutual support. Many developed what modern psychology would recognize as Stockholm Syndrome, forming emotional attachments to the men who owned and abused them. The legal framework supporting sexual slavery was particularly insidious. While religious texts regulated slavery, the practical application within elite households provided detailed protocols about the treatment of concubines that appeared to offer protection while actually codifying their status as property. Women could be bought, sold, gifted, or inherited like any other valuable possession. Their children belonged to their masters, creating situations where mothers had no legal relationship to their own offspring. Perhaps most disturbing was how the system created its own perpetuation. Concubines who bore sons might see those boys taken away to become eunuchs or soldiers, while daughters often became concubines themselves. The trauma was literally inherited, passing from generation to generation as families were systematically destroyed by a system that treated human reproduction as a form of livestock breeding. The concubine system had achieved something unprecedented in human history: the complete sexual subjugation of an entire class of women who were conditioned to participate in their own exploitation. The systematic brutality of slavery under the Caliphates reached its peak in the labor camps that dotted the empire's territories, where enslaved people were worked to death in conditions so horrific that they sparked the largest slave rebellion in pre-modern history. The Zanj Rebellion of 869–883 CE exposed the industrial scale of slavery's horror when hundreds of thousands of East African slaves rose up against their masters, southern Iraq. The Zanj slaves labored in the salt marshes of southern Mesopotamia, performing backbreaking work that involved removing layers of salt-crusted earth to expose arable soil beneath. This wasn't temporary agricultural work, but a systematic operation that required slaves to spend entire days standing in caustic water that burned their skin while carrying heavy loads that destroyed their bodies over time. Working conditions were designed to extract maximum labor while minimizing costs. Slaves received barely enough food to maintain their strength, lived in makeshift shelters that provided no protection from the elements, and received no medical care when injuries or illness made them less productive. When slaves became too weak or sick to work, they were simply abandoned to die and replaced with fresh captures. The scale of the operation was staggering. Historical sources suggest that over 500 Zanj slaves were working in the marshes at the rebellion's peak, representing one of the largest concentrations of enslaved labor in human history. The economic value of their work supported the Abbasid government's expansion and funded the construction of Baghdad, making slave labor essential to the empire's prosperity. But the true horror wasn't just physical suffering. It was the complete dehumanization of the enslaved workers. Slaves were identified by numbers rather than names, fed like animals, and treated as disposable equipment that could be replaced when it wore out. Guards used systematic violence to maintain control, with public executions and torture serving as regular reminders of what happened to those who resisted. The psychological impact was devastating. Slaves were deliberately separated from family members and people who shared their language or culture, creating isolation that made resistance seem impossible. They were forced to compete against each other for food and shelter, preventing the solidarity that might lead to organized rebellion. When the Zand Rebellion finally erupted, its scale and violence shocked the empire. Slaves didn't just seek freedom. They systematically massacred their former masters, destroyed the infrastructure that had oppressed them, and created an independent state that controlled southern Iraq for 14 years. The rebellion's success revealed both the depth of slave suffering and the massive scale of the system that had created it. The eventual suppression of the rebellion was equally brutal, with Abbasid forces conducting systematic genocide against rebel populations to ensure such an uprising could never happen again. The ultimate expression of slavery's systematic cruelty within the Caliphate territories emerged in the creation of child soldiers who were kidnapped, converted, and psychologically conditioned to fight against their own people. The Mamluk and Ghilman systems represented the perfection of psychological manipulation, creating warriors who were simultaneously elite fighters and completely powerless slaves. The process began with the systematic kidnapping of boys between 8 and 14 from the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Balkans. These children were specifically chosen for their perceived martial potential and their distance from the empire's core territories, ensuring they had no local connections that might compromise their loyalty to their masters. Training was designed to completely reshape the boys' identities and loyalties. They were immediately separated from other slaves and placed in specialized military schools where they learned theology, Arabic language, and military skills. But the education was accompanied by systematic psychological conditioning that made them emotionally dependent on their masters while psychologically incapable of rebellion. The conditioning process was particularly insidious because it convinced the boys that their enslavement was actually liberation. Trainers taught them that their capture had saved them from lives of poverty and ignorance, while their military training would make them elite warriors worthy of respect. They learned to feel grateful for their slavery rather than resentful, creating psychological bonds that were stronger than physical chains. Physical training was brutal and designed to create soldiers who valued death over defeat. Boys learned to fight with various weapons, developed exceptional physical fitness, and mastered tactics that made them superior to freeborn soldiers. But they also learned that their value lay entirely in their willingness to die for their masters, creating a death-seeking mentality that made them incredibly effective but ultimately disposable. The most disturbing aspect of the system was how it turned victims into perpetrators. Mamluk soldiers often participated in raids that captured new children for the same system that had enslaved them. They became enforcers of the very system that had destroyed their own childhoods, creating cycles of trauma that perpetuated across generations. Despite their military elite status, slave soldiers remained property that could be bought, sold, or executed at their master's whim. Their training and conditioning made them valuable, but it also made them dangerous to their owners. Some rulers solved this problem by systematically eliminating veteran Mamluks once they became too experienced or potentially independent. The psychological toll was devastating. Slave soldiers developed complex trauma responses that made normal human relationships impossible. They formed intense bonds with their military units while remaining isolated from broader society. Many became addicted to violence as the only activity that gave their lives meaning, creating warriors who were psychologically incapable of peacetime existence. The system's ultimate cruelty lay in how it made resistance impossible through psychological rather than physical means. Slave soldiers were given weapons and training that could have enabled rebellion, but their conditioning made them incapable of using these skills against their masters. They had been so thoroughly programmed to serve that freedom became psychologically terrifying rather than desirable. When individual Mamluks did attempt escape or rebellion, the The punishments were designed to terrorize other slaves into continued obedience. Public executions, torture, and systematic destruction of the rebels' former comrades served as constant reminders that resistance meant not just personal death, but the destruction of everyone they cared about. The systematic horrors of slavery under the Caliphates reveal how religious and legal frameworks can be manipulated to justify the most extreme forms of human exploitation. If this exploration of power's darkest expressions has left you questioning what other buried truths lurk in history's shadows, click the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that authorities tried to erase. Subscribe to continue uncovering the horrific realities behind civilization's most carefully constructed lies.